Here we go. There we are. We are live, Ryan Ray, alongside the man, the myth, the legend himself, the karaoke singer, the one, the only, Chris Fenton. Mr. Fenton, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm good, man. I'm feeling so good. Yeah, I did put out a little tweet of my Mandarin karaoke the other day. I don't know. I was feeling a little frisky. Figured I would circulate that to the populace.
Yeah, it was good. It was good. your mannerisms and everything. You weren't just like, some people do karaoke. They get up there, they can sing really good, but they're kind of wooden. You had the whole entertainer thing down. It was really good. I don't know what you said or what you sang about, but it was good.
Yeah, that song was Dwayman the New High Can Go Lie, Can Go Lie. It's like it's a pop like type of tune that's been around for many years, almost like in the vein of like Hanson's Bop or something. It's on every karaoke machine there, so it's always nice to sort of throw that out as as an American in a karaoke bar where no one expects you to sing in Mandarin. And then I've learned a couple others over time, so it's always sort of fun to circulate that stuff. Anyway, there's a lot going on. I mean, we haven't been on in a week. I'm not even sure where to start other than, one really amazing thing that happened over the weekend for both of us is that the Chinese rocket debris did not hit either of our houses. Right. And particularly you're in the middle of a closing. So it's good that the rocket didn't hit during inspections.
Actually, if the rocket would have hit, I got that insurance money and it saved me a lot of trouble. I could have just leveled it and sold the lot. So it would be pretty good.
I don't know. That might be considered like a force majeure event.
Oh,
I'm not sure if housing insurance policy. And by the way, it's probably underwritten by like Ping An Bank or HNA or something like that. So who the heck knows whether
if a Chinese rocket landed on the board board of advisors for a U.S.-China Foundation's house, there would be questions, right? Like people would say, yeah, it's something fishy's going here. I might be considered targeted.
Well, that's what I was saying. Like if that thing hit me, I would have thought maybe, hey, you know what? I'm relatively down the middle on the hawk to dove scale. I feel like I've been practical and constructive with everything. It seems like the Chinese are still listening to me. I'm not in persona non grata territory. But if that rocket did hit my house, I think I would have switched my belief that maybe I'm not as enjoyed in China as I used to be.
Okay. Let's see here. So you mentioned there is all kinds of stuff. Let's go to Xinjiang province because that is kind of getting picked up from a couple of different angles. Apple is now being accused of, I think, 7 suppliers, if I have the number right, are using the forced labor there. There's another group that's saying that they're helping the people. This is a story that it's kind of like, you wake up and you got this rash and it just won't go away. It's not a full-blown problem. You can take a little Benadryl. It kind of goes away for a few days, and then it comes back. But it's not going away. And while it's not getting maybe the attention internationally that I would like for it to, it's good to see that the story has teeth and it gets traction, and the media still wants to pursue the angles on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating story to me because it just goes to show what human instincts and humans tend to pay attention to versus not pay attention to. I mean, I would argue in the scheme of national security and economic security issues that we have in the engagement with China, what's happening in Xinjiang province is very low on the priority scale. And we have looked the other way lots of times over the years at various human rights issues globally. We've talked about that until we're blue in the face. And once again, the Xinjiang province issue with human rights atrocities to the Uyghurs, which are terrible, which are super tragic, which are things that we should all care about, quite frankly, are the things getting the headlines out there, which is allowing the attention of journalists, politicians, and the American public and the American citizens to pay attention to some of the issues involved with the U.S.-China relationship and why things must change. And it's doing the same thing around the world. And we're going to talk about some of those other countries too today.
Yeah, so I've got a question for you. I've wondered about why this issue is now grabbing teeth. And I think we have to be real that part of the China heat from the U.S. press is that Trump is gone. And so you're not aligning yourself with Trump by getting on China. So you see that on some level. But beyond that, what about this story? Because there are human rights issues in Saudi Arabia or plenty of other nations that we work with, a lot more friendly with than China, at least from a top to top level. And I was just watching the miniseries on FX, the O.J. Simpson one, and so I get in the O.J. craze every few years, and I'll go read a book about it or I'll watch a few documentaries. And so I've never seen The People versus O.J. Simpson, and I watched it. And that was in 94, 95 that happened, right? And this is 2021. Yet that story still fascinates me. There's been a lot more interesting trials since then, interesting things. But yeah, that's still got teeth. It's hard to pinpoint why it has teeth, but it does. And so when I think about the CCP and the Uyghur story, it's like, why does this story have teeth? Why does it keep getting the attention? And I wonder, Chris, with this story in particular, is it because the way the CCP handles it almost makes you want to talk about it more? Like if they would just come out and be like, yeah, we got slaves, so what? Like people would be like, okay, they admitted it, they're bad people, and we kind of go on. But the kind of the denial and acting stupid almost makes people want to prove you wrong. And so therefore they're on a quest to say, hey, no, you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this. And so the CCP, if they were just going to own this, I'm not saying they would be good, but I wonder if the story would die down. And the fact that they're denying it makes people keep wanting to prove them wrong.
Yeah, I'm going to go. I actually am a little more, I guess, human instinct based in why this is carrying such an attention span over the typical news cycle. And a lot of that has to do with pictures speak 1,000 words. I mean, I'm in the Hollywood business. Motion pictures carry a lot of weight because of what they tell in a story visually, as well as with audio and everything else. If we're now starting to see photos, I mean, before they used to be sort of, coming from, the edge of the left or the right type of websites or YouTube videos or whatever, but now they're being covered by mainstream media. They're becoming covered by Fox, et cetera. And people are now recognizing that there's an issue that in some similarities has things that are similar to some of the atrocities that have happened just over the last century, including World War II, et cetera. So that's carrying a lot of weight. And then on top of it, like every movie, which carries so much gravitas because of what you see visually, all great movies tend to have movie stars, right? They have known brands, known commodities in it, which pull people's interest into the stories themselves. And in the case of the Xinjiang province, in the case of the Uyghur atrocities, a lot of big branded names are getting pulled into it, whether it's the NBA, whether it's Hugo Boss, whether it's Nike, whether it's Apple, whether it's H&M, whether it's Adidas. These are names that are really well known around the world. So when you hear a brand name, i.e. a movie star, put together with a really atrocious looking photo or an atrocious story, the stories of the rape or whatever, the things that are happening to the Uyghurs that are being told in first person or in third person perspectives, that carries a lot of weight. And it's carrying way more weight than, oh my gosh, they're building artificial reefs in the South China Sea. Oh my gosh, they flew into Taiwanese airspace. Oh my gosh, there's tariffs, there's protectionist policies. Oh, they just stole more tech, IP from one of the Silicon Valley juggernauts. That stuff is nefarious. That stuff is bad. That stuff we need to address. But the story of what's grabbing people's attention tends to be in that Xinjiang province and what's happening to real people there.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That if you think about like Saudi Arabia or whatnot, it's usually not attached to something bigger than random person X or random group Y. And so the Uyghurs, they're kind of in that group, but they're being catapulted by a larger name. I like that. That's a good point. Okay, speaking of big names, Jack Ma showed his face in a rare appearance yesterday. At the same time, the news was breaking that Alibaba and Tencent were getting hammered again. So I don't know if those two things were coincidental or what's going on. But man, they can't catch a break.
Well, and then on top of it, Meituan, the food delivery service, is under all kinds of scrutiny now from regulators. And my point on all of this is like, look, U.S. investors, passive investors, are in funds that are investing in these things. And there is no active involvement or active narration of what they're actually invested in. And a lot of these funds, a lot of these portfolios have big stakes in these companies. And quite frankly, these companies are not things that you can gauge value on just simply on a P&L level, which, by the way, we actually have a hard time figuring out too, because of lots of SEC guidelines and regulations that they don't have to follow because of state secret laws, because of their affiliation with state-owned enterprises, or the fact that they are part of the CCP government. So in a lot of cases, we have unsuspecting investors invested in things that literally can turn on a dime their share prices because of something that the CCP wants to implicate them of, or something they want them to be restricted of. And we saw that in the case of Ant and Alibaba, and lots of American investors were involved in Ant, and obviously lots of investors more are involved with Alibaba because it's publicly traded here in US markets. Tencent the same way. We have private investors involved in Meituan. We have lots of different unsuspecting investors and some very sophisticated ones that are tied up in things that literally the CCP can turn on a dime. And that is something that the SEC and various other regulatory bodies have to start looking at, because it presents a real national security and economic security interest.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you wonder how long it takes to see the U.S. investor side, these big, large funds that you're talking about, shift away from Alibaba and put their money somewhere else. And so that is something that will have to happen, though, right? Like you can't, the investors, whatever issue it is that you think the investors care about, the number one is making money. And so as long as they're making money off Alibaba, they're going to keep putting the money there. But if they start getting massive losses, they'll pull out pretty quick. And usually Wall Street pretends like it's at least scared of stuff like this, but in this case, I don't get the feeling. I mean, I think Alibaba's trading at what, $220 a share, something like that right now.
Yeah, it has fallen through a lot of this Ant Financial chaos, but it's still a very valuable stock. And what's interesting is if you read Chaos Under Heaven, Josh Rogan's book, or you read a lot of the thought and narrative that Matt Pottinger, who was with the NSA under the Trump administration for years, talks about, is the influence that the Chinese Communist Party has on America. And we know a lot of the ones out there in the open, obviously. But what's interesting is in the investment community, first of all, there's so much money to make by being engaged with China, with Wall Street. It's hard to blame them if that's all it's about. But the problem is these funds, the passive investor funds, the funds that hundreds of millions of Americans are involved with without really knowing the ramifications, as they start to understand what's in those funds, they become advocates for the Chinese Communist Party also. For instance, if CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and the Securities and Exchange Commission and the administration and Congress decide to get hard on foreign investment going out, or investment from the United States going out towards China, and perhaps tries to restrict from some of these companies from having access to U.S. capital markets, that causes an immediate negative impact on the share price of those companies, and also affects hundreds of millions of people's portfolios here in the United States of America. And if you're one of those people, are you going to be excited that we're getting hawkish or tougher on China in that way? Or are you going to be thinking about your own money and going, wait a minute, that hawkish policy, that policy that might have national security interests at stake, is also affecting my own portfolio. And that's my nest egg. That's my economic security. I don't support that. If somebody supports that in Washington, D.C., I'm going to vote them out of office. And that's exactly what the Chinese Communist Party is trying to get across, and trying to gain that influential edge on us over time. It's that chess game that they're playing.
No, it's funny because I argue often that cross-border trade is what prevents wars. And what you're saying is that China is taking that and reversing it, saying cross-border wars is going to not only prevent trade, but it's also going to allow them to expand their dominance, which is an interesting perspective.
Well, let's face it. I mean, obviously, as Bill Bishop sent out today, and also Axios put out yesterday, this 500% increase in propaganda spending that China is going to put into the United States of America market to try to push their narrative. That is a huge, huge information war, whatever you want to call it, a propaganda play that they're doing. But they're also playing the business lobby, and they're playing with American citizens' pocketbooks. And that, I would argue, carries even more weight than some of the stuff you might read in the paper or watch on television. Everybody knows that everything stops with the buck. So if they can get the buck to stop in most people, most voters, daily situations, they're going to get the support of the American public unwittingly supporting the Chinese Communist Party and whatever their prerogatives are.
Just real quick, that $500 million that they're going to dump into the economy, if they want to send me a check.
No, 500%, a 500% increase.
Oh, 500%. Okay, whatever. They want to send me 100% of that 500% directly. It's a one-time payment. I'll do a 1-hour special for them. We'll call it even. We'll go from there. So I'm just saying, everybody's got a price. I'm a capitalist, so everybody's got a price, but it's no installments, one-time payment. So, okay, let's. You mentioned Josh Rogan and the other guy, the book Stronger, I believe it is.
Yeah, Ryan Haas.
And that's the other thing that's kind of been interesting here is that there's always books on China, right? Coming out, there's always some kind of book about good or bad, but it feels like. And maybe this is the advent of the new media age that we're in, where someone can go on Rogan's podcast and get 4 or 5 million views of their stuff, and then compared to a 30-second or 2-minute CNN clip. But it feels like we're actually seeing the journalist not only write books about China, but then go on long form podcasts and have to talk about it, and that saturates the conversation in a culture that we couldn't have gotten 20 or 30 years ago. So you also have. So you have two things. You have the books, which you always had, but then you have the journalists talking about the book for 2 or 3 hours, and then that really takes the conversation to new directives, it seems, or new directions, rather.
Well, look, I mean, I'm keeping no secret that I have a bit of a man crush on Josh Rogan and Chaos Under Heaven, mainly because his points of view are so similar to mine and what I talk about in my book. And as I've mentioned before, he comes at the perspective of the U.S.-China engagement with a particular focus of the Trump administration and a third-party view of what was happening behind the scenes. While I was writing a book about my first-person experiences in the engagement with U.S. and China, and then also sort of what I was thinking was going on behind the scenes, but wasn't exactly sure. And it's so awesome to read Josh talking about it in a way that makes me go, oh, I'm completely validated in what I suspected there. And then in other cases, I'm going, oh, well, that's something I never even knew. And now it all makes sense, right? And part of, I guess, being somebody that people want to talk to about the China, space, the U.S.-China space, being labeled whatever, a China expert or a thought leader or whatever it is really understanding points of view from all different directions. I mean, quite frankly, I'm a little bit of a China geek now. I spend more time listening to other people talk about China than I talk about China, and that's hard to do. And it's interesting because you have these new current books, one of which is Ryan Haas from the Brookings Institute, who's also part of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and has been a State Department official for, I think, 20 years. He wrote a book called Stronger, which I'm now getting through, which I also love, not because I completely agree with everything he says, but I really appreciate the perspective that he brings and the fact that it's influencing the way I look at stuff. I mean, one of the big things that I'm pulling away from Stronger is that he looks at China as this sleeping giant that's rising, and sort of like Anthony Blinken said the other day, we want to contain its rise in certain ways. We don't want to prevent it. And he's saying one of the best things we can do to do that is to look inwardly, just like the Chinese do, and try to make our country the best it can be, because the competition between U.S. and China is not going away at any anytime in the near future. So in a way, a sports team knows that their rivalry is always going to be at their A game. We want to be at our A game so we can always compete with them at the best level possible. And then he also talks about a lot of the weaknesses that we need to perceive about China. And you talk about this quite often on the show, the fact that we got to stop being so insecure about China, right? Like they have a lot of issues that we don't have here. For instance, energy security, food security, both things that you've talked about, water security, a lot of things that are going to stifle their rise in certain ways. So we got to stop thinking they're going to dominate the world in 5 years and start thinking about the fact that, hey, they are rising. We need to address things in the near term that are super, super important to our own economic, national security, freedom of speech rights, human rights, all that other kind of stuff. But we don't have to look at it like a zero-sum game. Now, some of that I 100% agree with. Some of that I'm thinking about, tinkering in my head. And some of the stuff I go, oh, maybe he's a little dovish there. But what's important for everyone is to engage with all these different perspectives because they're coming at us both in the current time and then there's great books from the past, the books from, well, you like reading Mao from the way past of the modern era, but then also lots of books from the 80s and 90s that sort of talk about the history and how we got to this point. Uh-oh, you're pulling out Mao.
I keep Mao right beside me.
There he is.
I keep him right beside me. There he is. I'm actually reading about the Boxer Rebellion right now. But a lot of good points there, Chris. And so let me kind of unpack this a little bit. And this, I think, when I talk to people not about China, I always reference China because I always say, for me, China kind of represents, I said this podcast before, which reminds me, this is a podcast. So if you catch any of this, go download Feeding the Dragon podcast to catch the whole thing. But, we're talking, I was on a guest on the show this morning, and they're asking about this pipeline that Whitmer is trying to shut down from Canada to the U.S., and it goes on a spot in Michigan. And I said, well, here's the thing. If whatever the constitutionality is, pull that aside. If she shuts it down, and we've already shut down several pipelines coming out of Canada, and then Canada starts selling their oil to China, we're going to be jumping up and down going, oh my gosh, what are we doing? Canada's now selling their oil to China. Well, they tried to sell it to us. We have to come to policy or philosophy, I would say that, over person or party. And so that's the thing. What is your philosophical belief about government, about how it should work, how it should operate? And so some of these things that you're hitting on are very much that, right? How do we handle the energy policy? How do we handle stuff? And Americans we've really lost that. It's very much party or person. Now we identify with them. We're Trump, we're Biden, we're Democrat, we're Republican. And we don't really have a lot of meat on the bone. So the only concern with everything you said is, he said, hey, America needs to do America. We have to determine what America is. Now I have my opinion on that and you have yours and everyone has theirs. But we have to start working through that because the best way, in my opinion, to compete with China is by being a free market society, not trying to compete with them at what they're doing. Because as you point out, there are things that they're whiffing on. Oh, by the way, they just reported that their population did not grow last year. Now, we talk about their numbers all the time. I'm confused by this. I'm really, really curious your thoughts. For them to say that, that's not a badge of honor. Okay, I don't think it's a pride. Like they're like, oh, look at us. I think it's kind of a kick in the teeth a little bit, which makes me wonder if the population actually declined and they're not wanting to tell. And so that's kind of them pumping the numbers up a little bit. But the other thing is this goes back to their one-child policy way back when and starving people way back when and not having food security for 40 years. All of this is coming home to roost. And so before we look to China and go, oh, we want to be like them, there are issues that they have. And some of them are self-inflicted and some of them are just geographic. Everyone has geographic constraints. So I'll quit rambling and let you respond.
Well, this is where I'm going to be completely what America is all about and say you and I disagree on the subject of population growth. I actually think growing populations is a way to essentially allow for this overhang of debt because we're constantly saying, oh, we're going to keep growing so we can keep putting more debt on because we're able to pay it off down the road. I would say what China just announced by not having population growth is very good for their food and energy security issues, which is probably a high priority, but it's not very good for their creditors because their creditors are expecting them to continue building a consumer class, which means lots of young people that are out there working and buying products and services. And if you have a slowing population growth and one that's also getting older, you're not going to be able to fulfill that. The other thing that I'm going to say that's also great about being American is that you brought up earlier the fact that a lot of the China discussion was hard to have because it was sort of owned by Trump, right? Now President Trump is out of the way. You have this ability for bipartisan support on a challenge that's facing the country. And quite frankly, if we're looking at what makes us American, I sort of like the fact that, once again, we talked about this before, that there is this common challenge that can unite us on things like freedom of speech, human rights, national security, economic security issues. Those are things that can make America American and make us strive to be the best we can be there. And then we can put all this cultural warfare stuff and guns and all that other thing that no one seems to agree on to the side and focus on being the best we can be as a country. And then all that stuff that's on the side is actually what makes us great as a country. It makes us allowed to speak up about things we don't like about, somebody else's preference or whatever, and criticize and have constructive conversations or destructive, whatever they are. But as long as we can come together on some important issues that allow us to rise to our best level, that's fantastic. And one of the things I'll add, once again, on my man crush with Josh Rogan, is that I have noticed, is going on the left and on the right, promoting his book, obviously, but I love what his book's about. So I am super pushing his book. Also, he was on Steve Bannon. He was on Glenn Beck. He writes for the Washington Post. He's been on every left-leaning thing. He was on Anthony Scaramucci's, SALT podcast. He's all over the place. Joe Rogan, who's sort of down the middle, but also controversial. He's doing it all because it affects everybody. And that's what I love. And I love the fact that he is getting away with it, which means he is stunningly showing that this is what America is about. You can have your own beliefs, but you can talk to people of different beliefs and different arguments and different discussion points and all that kind of stuff, because that's what makes our country great. And China seems to be allowing that, crossover of different left and right principles and libertarian and everything else. And I am super excited about it. And I'm glad to see Josh taking advantage of it.
Yeah, if you took the Venn diagram of the Bannon listenership and then the CNN listenership, there's a very, very small sliver of joint listeners there. So that's what I was saying earlier about the new media age allows for these conversations and why we want to promote them, because you could have a Bannon, a Scaramucci, a Rogan, a Young Turks, whatever. Everyone can have their opinion, and then let people come on and talk about them, and then that's how you have these conversations. I will, because we're friends. I'm going to send you a book, and you will read this book in your coming time, and then you will come on the podcast and you say, Ryan, you were right about population growth. We need it. It was going away. It was a bad thing, and then we will agree on that issue, and we will move forward because you're my friend. The book will be in the mail soon. So
don't watch last Friday's Bill Maher telecast, because he goes off on the whole population growth thing. We need to cut a lot of the population out. But
I'll just tell you. I'll be completely honest. People, serious intellectuals that hold this position, have not done, or they're not doing any research. And Bill Maher's not a serious intellectual, so he's just a talking head like me. Okay, so TikTok. Hey, are you on TikTok?
I have TikTok. I have the app mainly because I try to see what my kids are watching, and yes, they're on it. And it's still, I don't understand where that all went in the news cycle, what kind of black hole it disappears into in Washington, D.C., but it never got resolved. And there seems to be new announcements every day about TikTok, new CEO, blah, 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 new app, that's coming out. What is going on? Why is our attention span so terrible? If the same thing were happening in China, they would probably have a whole chess plan over 5 years of what they're doing behind the scenes. And then suddenly, when we least expect it, they come out and they go, this is what we've been doing. You thought we weren't even thinking about it.
But see, okay, I think that you tapped into something earlier today. So we've had 3 stories that I think we could run this thread through. First, we got the Uyghurs. Then we got the pension funds. And now we have TikTok, right? Okay, with the Uyghurs, what you have attached is, as you said, these name brands, these staples of America, larger than life companies. Everyone relates to. There's pressure. There's a target. It's visible. Pension funds, man, they're pension funds. Like they're nameless. Like how many pension fund, how many big Wall Street managers can you name? Not many. And then now you have TikTok. Well, TikTok's just an app, right? And so I wonder, going back to your first point, because so let's just say I don't know who big TikTokers are, but insert celebrity TikToker or real celebrity here. If it turned out that the CCP was doing something with their data, right? Or like have their camera on all the time watching, I don't know, whatever. I think the narrative might change. But to your point, there's not big names that are attached to the story, and maybe that's why it's kind of getting lost in the phrase that it's not really, people don't take it seriously because it's kind of a dance goofy app. But then on top of that, big names aren't concerned about it.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you might be right. The brand identification with TikTok, away from what's actually on the TikTok itself or the app, which, by the way, everybody under 18 plays around with, but they're not out there telling the news cycle what to pay attention to. But I guess the brand names earlier were really Peter Navarro, Donald Trump, Larry Ellison, who was trying to buy it, as you recall, some of the big, private equity companies, which maybe weren't known as brands, but they branded with Wall Street and what Wall Street was trying to get done. And then on top of it, you had another brand identity, which is a massive number, right? Because TikTok is owned by ByteDance, and there were numbers thrown around that ByteDance is the largest privately held company that's worth $500 billion, right? Like those numbers are hard to not notice, and that's the brand identification that I think you're talking about.
No, yes, I'm saying. I think go back to your first thing. Like it's not. So you do have the kind of negative connotation, but you also don't have the positive connotation as well. So maybe it's even double worse. But it's just thinking about your point earlier, which was a great point. I think it could apply to some of these other stories. Why they don't get the attention is that they're just not. It's just not. So if a large teachers union came out and lost, $1 million or $1 billion of their fund, it'd probably carry a little bit of weight, right? But it would take someone probably like, I don't know, Bill Gates or some education advocate right now to be like, oh my gosh, we've got to sound the alarm bells. I think you've made a very astute point that probably connects our frustration with some of these other stories. TikTok, I think.
Well, by the way, it's also, if you even look at the Oscars and Chloe Zhao and Nomadland, right? The Oscars barely got 9 million viewers. Nomadland did not make a lot of money. It was a beautiful film. I loved it. I thought it was great. Chloe Zhao, not a household name. So the only thing that really carries attention in what was going on in that geopolitical event, which a lot of insiders are still talking about a lot, but it's not, you don't see it every day, is the fact that there's a Marvel movie riding on it called The Eternals, which is a huge blockbuster, right? But like if you took that same story with Nomadland, Chloe Zhao and the Oscars, and you did it during an Oscar year where they got 50 million viewers, where the movie that was involved was, say, Titanic, and instead of Chloe Zhao it was Leonardo DiCaprio, then suddenly you would have what is a really interesting geopolitical story known by a handful of people on the coasts, instead known by everybody around the country. And once again, it goes into the brand identification and the movie stardom of whatever that news cycle story is.
Let me ask you this. 2 quick Hollywood stories. We'll wrap it up here. First, any take on the Golden Globes leaving NBC? I don't know if it means anything, if it's relevant, if that's a standard that change. Just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Look, the racial diversity, equality, equity story in Hollywood and on the coast is a huge thing. Hollywood.
Is that what it's about? I didn't even know. I just saw they left. I didn't know what happened.
No, Hollywood Foreign Press has always been an enigma anyway as to why we care about whatever it is, 45 foreign journalists from little markets in Europe. But on top of it, the fact that it came out that there was zero diversity whatsoever in the whole membership, and the Hollywood Foreign Press has not been doing much to cure that. And we're in a world where that's very sensitive stuff. And we had a bunch of studios say, we're not going to be involved with the Hollywood Foreign Press or the Golden Globes anymore. And NBC suddenly had no choice but to get out of it. So that's what happened there. And that's obviously part of the cultural things that are like dividing the country a little bit. And that's why I try to stay out of that lane and stay focused on China. But there are little bits and pieces in some of this stuff that really sort of resonates into some of the larger issues that we have with China too. So anyway, it's a good question.
I had no idea. I just saw on Twitter NBC won't do the Golden Globes. I don't watch them. I don't even know which award that's TV. I guess I don't even know what the Golden Globes are for. So
yeah, Golden Globes was sort of I guess more of a fun one to watch because everybody was drinking in the ceremony itself. So like people would get on stage and they'd be sloshed and say something really funny, and then they'd always try to have funny hosts do it. And part of it also was that comedies and television were involved in it too, so you'd have more of a fun, like drunken atmosphere, and it got really good ratings. But now
is that the one that Ricky Gervais was always crushing them at?
What's that?
Is that the one where Ricky Gervais was always going to and making fun of it? Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay. He had those great lines about China and how like Hollywood is so beholden to China and kowtowing to them constantly. There's some great lines in there.
Yeah. Okay. So final thing is, we are in May now, Chris, and In the Same Breath documentary is still not out on HBO Max.
It's funny.
It's kind of getting buried, isn't it?
I've been asking about that. Apparently, it did premiere at South by Southwest, but HBO wasn't really involved with it. It was more involved.
Okay.
The company Cinetech was really doing most of the promotion. Apparently, it's still coming out from HBO this year. I'm still curious to see. I mean, it's a really interesting story to watch. Obviously, there's not a lot of people paying attention to it, but I am curious to see if the big conglomerate, Warner Media and AT&T, told HBO they can't air it. So we'll see. And the final thought I'll bring up on this episode is I just hope the guy that's clinging to the broken glass overhang thousands of feet in the air in China, I don't know if you've seen that story, but high winds caused the glass floor to break through of this like overhang, sort of a la what they have in the Grand Canyon, but in a part of China that's over a canyon. And apparently the guy has been clinging on there for a long time, and they're trying to save him. And it's an eye-opening story of my guess, somebody CCP official had a family member who said, "Hey, I can build that thing. I've never done it before, but give me the contract." And there you go. That's what happens.
It's wild. Yeah. No, I've seen it. It's wild. It's wild. I'll see if I can find a good picture.
That's, by the way, the epitome in Hollywood. We call that a cliffhanger.
A cliffhanger. Well, I will tell you this. I will leave you with this. I mentioned earlier, The People vs. O.J. Simpson. It was for a show that's not about something that you know the results. It was a fantastic show. And so if you haven't seen that, I had no interest in watching it because I've watched a lot of documentaries, read the books, but I just finished that the other day, and it was really good. So a lot of cliffhangers, and I know the outcome. It was impressive. So, Mr. Fenton, nice. It was good to be back on here.
Yeah, I agree. By the way, one other thing, our last episode, the biggest downloaded episode so far.
There we go.
So thank you, everyone, for listening.
Share, subscribe, rate, review, do all that stuff for us. And with that, we'll be back very soon.